One evening I was scrolling through Pinterest and found this beautiful Japanese rocking chair. It looked so good that I had to make one, but the only problem was I didn't have the required material and tools for the project. In our workshop we only have a little bit of plywood, a CNC router and the tool stations we had built previously on this channel. So to make the rocking chair from what we have, we first have to redesign it. I like the construction of the Japanese chair and how the craftsman used dovetail and wedge joints for the seat and other parts. And my favorite thing about the chair was the solution for attaching the backrest. But since we will be using plywood instead of hardwood when making our rocking chair, we will have to use different joinery and simplify some of the components. So after hours spent designing, this was my take on the Japanese rocking chair. It looked nice and simple to make, right? Well, I'm not too sure about the simple to make part. Since all the parts will consist of two components glued together, there is a possibility the components won't fit together as nicely as they should. Anyway, without much hesitation, I went to the workshop and cut my plywood sheets into more manageable sizes, loaded them on the CNC router and cut the first components. Since all the parts will consist of two pieces, I wanted to check how well they will fit together. If the fit wasn't perfect, I would have to make one of the parts slightly bigger and trim the excess material after gluing them together, but they fit nicely, so I carried on with the CNC operations. At this point you might have noticed that none of the joint tenons has dog bone corners. There is a good reason for it. You know, this chair has the potential to find itself among high-end furniture pieces. Every woodworker knows that most plywood furniture is made on the CNC router, but when looking at the high-end pieces, you don't see the dog bones, so it's not obvious. The clients that would happily spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars on a chair probably wouldn't like to see the CNC marks on their new furniture, so for this project I decided to avoid using the dog bones. You also might have noticed that all the parts have these little holes in the middle. They will be useful when gluing the components together. But before we glue the parts, we have to remove the support tabs and cut the dowels into smaller pieces. I had these 8mm dowels for the positioning, but they had to be shorter than 20mm to fit inside the positioning holes. At first I tried to cut them on our bandsaw, but this felt like a perfect way to lose a finger or two. So I took one of the 18mm offcuts from the offcut box and drilled a bunch of holes in it. The idea was to hammer the dowels in the offcut and cut them at the surface level. It turned out fantastic. This approach was way safer than cutting the dowels of the bandsaw, and the dowel length was around 18mm, so they will fit perfectly inside the positioning holes. After cutting around 40 shorter dowel pieces, I could glue the parts together. I started with the smaller parts by smearing glue on both components, adding the dowels and clamping them together. This was a perfect task for the clamps we built in the last video, and they performed flawlessly, so I felt confident I would be able to clamp multiple backrest and seat components at the same time. Since I have 11 clamps, I could do 4 components at the same time, which sped up the process. While gluing the smaller parts together, I was wondering how well the large clamps will be able to pull together the chair sides when assembling the whole project. And to be honest, I wasn't 100% sure they wouldn't break, especially when gluing the chair. But before we get to that, we still have to finish gluing the backrest and side components. And the 11 clamps that I had was barely enough for the side component glue up. But the sides turned out great, and the small clamps now have my trust for the future projects. Anyway, before we can assemble the chair and test how well everything will fit together, we have to trim the edges of each component and deal with the repercussions of not using the dog bone corners when making the parts on the CNC router. For trimming, I used 1/8" roundover bit. After trimming the edges, I had to remove the inside corner radiuses for each joint. I started with the backrest components. At first I tried cutting the radiuses with the Japanese spool saw, but soon I realized that chiseling the corners worked faster, and the half-lap joint was simple to fix. But when I got to the mortise and tenon joints, I was faced with a dilemma: chiseling the corners of each mortise or rounding over the edges of the tenons. Personally, I don't think there's much difference between the approaches, so I chose to chisel the corners of each mortise. I know this dilemma is topic of discussion among many woodworkers, so if you think I chose poorly, I recommend leaving your arguments in the comment section. Anyway, I chamfered the tenon edges and we finally were able to assemble the chair and test it to understand if all the work till this point was worth it. I started with the backrest. The half-lap joints were super simple to assemble. Then I could attach the backrest to one of the side components and add the seat parts. When those were in place, I attached the other side, and the chair looked astonishing, and most importantly, it was comfortable. So after quick assembling and testing, it was time to take it apart and sand the components. To avoid hammering the side components and risking damaging them, I decided to flip the moving jaws of the large clamp the other way around and push the joints open. It wasn't as fast, but it was a more gentle way to take apart the project. When the parts were separated, I clamped multiple seat components together and used the orbital sander to sand the plywood edges. And after forming a dust cloud in the workshop, I remembered we had made this downdraft sanding box, so I put it to use. The smaller parts and the backrest components were easy and relatively quick to sand. The side components, on the other hand, were more challenging. I clamped both of them together and used the orbital sander to sand the edges where I could reach them. And then I had to do some of the sanding by hand, and it wasn't the most enjoyable task of this project. After sanding all of the edges, I decided to go outside and ruin the beautiful evening for my neighbors and sanded the large surfaces. To finish the sanding, I went over all of the edges we trimmed on the router table. Finally, we were done with the sanding and we were left with two tasks that could make or break the project: gluing the chair together and applying the finish. My biggest concern when gluing larger projects together is that I wouldn't be able to apply the glue to all of the tenons and mortises and assemble the whole thing before the glue dries. In case that happens, all the work invested up to the gluing is for nothing, and you can start the project all over again. The backrest was relatively easy to glue together, but the stressful part started when gluing the side component to the back assembly and attaching the seat parts. Since I did the gluing on my own, I probably should have used a different glue that takes longer to set. I used PVA wood glue, which gave me a 5-minute time frame to get everything glued and clamped. And thankfully, I got it done in time. And the large clamps passed their usefulness test as well, but we still have to apply the finish, and my biggest fear was choosing the wrong type of finish that would change the plywood natural color to a yellowish one. I decided to go with a water-based coating and apply it multiple times with a piece of cloth. I started at the top of the backrest and worked my way to the bottom. Soon I realized that the cloth wasn't that effective when applying the finish, so I switched to a paint roller. But at the corners between the backrest and the seat, the roller was too big to fit, so I had to use a small brush. Probably spraying the chair would have been the best way to apply the finish. After the finish had set, I glued strips of furniture pads at the bottom of the rocking arches. After all the hard work, this is how the Japanese rocking chair turned out. I hope you enjoyed this build as much as I hated the sanding process. If you did, please leave a like and I'll see you in the next episode.